First, I want to call to your attention, for those of you who haven't seen the latest issue of EIR, which is on sale outside. This features LaRouche's piece on how Harry Truman defeated himself, but inside you will find a gem entitled How Abraham Lincoln Organized Victory for the Union. This is an article that was put together from transcripts and written notes by Graham over the last 1 to 2 years of his life. And it was put together heavily with the work of his collaborator of 37 years, Pamela Lowry, who is here with their sons, Colin and Malcolm, today. Can they stand, please? Now, as you've read in Lynn's tribute to Graham, he was a special kind of historian, one who put himself inside the minds of his subjects and thus identified the ideas which moved them and history. Such a mastery makes for excellent storytelling, but not just any stories, but the ones that give you the essence of the character and the situation. With this method, Graham developed early on. He was a history professor before he was in the Labor Committee, and in the course of his collaboration, enriched with his work with Lynn, he made breakthroughs critical to understanding the history of the American Republic. It was he that uncovered the Leibnizian roots of not only New England, but also Leibniz's networks in New York, Pennsylvania, and even Virginia. This wasn't easy work because, as Graham would stress, crucial figures such as Benjamin Franklin and Jonathan Swift often had to deliberately cover their tracks. The early 18th century, particularly in England, was not an easy place. It was a very dangerous place for a Republican. But Graham sorted it out and identified not just a network, but a strategic outlook, which began with the Winthrops and the Mathers in the late 17th century and developed into the thesis of his 1988 book, How the Nation Was Won. The waging of a coordinated offensive, even conspiracy, starting about 1710, to build a continental republic to outflank the European oligarchy at the time when republicanism in England and throughout Europe was being defeated. And this effort was not simply for those in America, but for all mankind. And while Benjamin Franklin came to be the key actor, and Graham developed, often with hilarity, how Franklin himself became the agent of the early Republicans like Mather, it would be too simple to simply restrict yourself to studying Ben. Graham uncovered a fascinating way in which the roles played by Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, George Washington's family, and many others developed into the successful fight for our republic. Now, this puts Graham in a tradition of history, of classical history, that is important for us to touch on briefly. In effect, it's the truthful method of telling history. And we certainly know how much history today is not truthful. I would cite two as being leaders in the tradition that Graham picked up. One would be Thucydides, who is often said to have been the first modern historian in his history of the Peloponnesian War, which occurred in the 5th century BC. And what characterized Thucydides, and from which we now understand, everything we essentially understand on the Peloponnesian War came from his work, was due to the method that he employed to uncover the truth about that war. Now, he was there. Thucydides was in the war. But he decided that he had to investigate the causes beyond his own experience, while yet interviewing and pursuing every story that he could possibly find to tell what the actual truth and causes of the events were. This was a method which he himself described in the following way, which I think is interesting. With regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, I have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses, whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. Not that even so the truth was easy to discover. Different eyewitnesses gave different accounts of the same events, speaking out of partiality for one side or the other, or else from imperfect memories. And it may well be that my history will seem less easy to read because the absence in it of a romantic element. It will be enough for me, however, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past, and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever. That is the method of a classical historian. The second I would cite would be Friedrich Schiller, and in particular his work, What Is and To What End Do We Study Universal History? Schiller, as some of you may or may not know, was not simply a dramatist. He was also a historian. As Lynn has stressed, the historical accuracy of his plays. This is not accidental by any means. This particular lecture was given on May 1789, a rather fateful time, right before the decisive days of the French Revolution. And he proceeded to make 3 points that I want to mention. First, he says, well, what is history? History is essentially a study of truth. It's the entire moral realm in which we live. And in this, if you've read much Leibniz, you have an understanding that when these Platonic thinkers think of the moral realm, they're thinking of the realm of ideas, in which the real causes of events and of man's actions really occur. The second thing that he says, that he develops, is the question of, well, why should we study history anyway? Why are you studying history, he says to his students. There are 2 approaches you can take. You can take the approach, the philosophical approach, or you can take the approach of the bread-fed scholar. Now, some of you may be familiar with this, the Brotgelehrte. We often simply quote the German. But that is the guy who's learning to get a job. Can I get a degree? What do I have to know to pass the test? Oh, they'll fail me if I tell the right answer? Okay, then I'll say the wrong answer. That kind of fellow. And in this sense, Graham was the absolutely quintessential philosophical mind that Schiller describes. And I urge you to get a copy. I think these are still available. The Poet of Freedom, Volume 2, and read this essay to get the delightful discussion of the approach that Graham himself took. And then third, Schiller describes, well, okay, so what is this history anyway? It's a process which determines the present. It's not simple. It's not simple because part of it was never written about. Part of it was only put down by oral tradition, which was highly unreliable. Part of it was the written word, but you can't believe documents, can you, on their face? I mean, say you took a document from the Bush administration, you're going to believe in decades to come that this was the truth? You're going to believe the Washington Post? They use that for history classes in school these days, but that's precisely what's the matter with the way history and current events are taught. And then he says, and even when you have some idea of people saw what happened, they can disagree, totally. So how do you look at determining what the truth is? And let me read you what he says. Out of the entire sum of these events, the universal historian selects those which have had an essential, irrefutable, and easily ascertainable influence upon the contemporary form of the world, and on the conditions of the generations now living. It is the relationship of an historical fact to the present constitution of the world, therefore, which must be seen in order to assemble material for world history. World history thus proceeds from a principle which is exactly contrary to the beginning of the world. The real succession of events descends from the origin of objects down to their most recent ordering. The universal historian ascends from the most recent world situation upwards toward the origin of things. When he ascends from the current view in centuries and thought to the next proceeding, and takes note of those among the events presented to him containing the explanation for the succeeding years and centuries, when he has continued this process stepwise up to the beginning, not of the world, for to that place there is no God, but to the beginning of the monuments, then he decides to retrace his steps on the path thus prepared, and to descend, unhindered and with light steps, with guide of those noted facts, from the beginning of the monuments down to the most recent age. That is the world history we have, and which will be presented to you. And I submit to you that that is precisely the method that Graham and any decent historian today would use. Look at the situation now. What determined that situation? What are the principles? Trace them back. Where did they come from? And then look at the way, then build backward toward what had to be the case, what you have to look for. How do we know that the American Revolution was the unique Republican breakthrough that it was? We knew it had to be, from the nature of the institutions which it had created. And therefore, you look with the mind's eye and with excruciatingly precise and painstaking research to find precisely what permits you to explain that current that occurs today. So, in fact, the way that Schiller describes this is the teleological principle, the purpose. There's no way to understand history without looking at its direction, without looking at its purpose. And therefore, you never, and you find this in Graham's writing in particular, see a set of facts. You see a purpose, a direction, a conspiracy, an outcome, and the ideas that make it possible. Now, since I've taken so much time, I think we want to go now to let Graham speak for himself. I have 3 film clips, and some of this I think a lot of you have not seen. The first one is from Labor Day 1995, when we were in full-scale battle against Newt Gingrich and the Conservative Revolution. And what you're going to hear is Graham discussing Bernard Mandeville, a very active figure with whom Franklin sparred in the early 18th century, but whose legacy is precisely that we face today. Can we have the first?
The task of the people of the United States, as conceived by our nation's founders, is fundamentally simple. It is to do good, and to do good such that others may have the opportunity to do likewise for the benefit of all mankind. That is also the function historically assigned to our constitutional republic, consistent with the fundamental idea of Western civilization, that man is created in the image of God and endowed with the power of creative reason. As a people, we owe, therefore, one great debt which has gone unpaid for too long, and that is our debt to history. One might even say that the account is overdrawn, so maybe we'll have to put through a little reorganization there as well. But I can assure you that the constitutional government of the United States was never intended to have Newt Gingrich, that pathetic bundle of diseased impulses, as Speaker of the House of Representatives. So he's got to go. But to ensure that, we have to defeat what he is, not just who he is. That's part of our debt to history. When you consider who he is, the task is simple. Just take out the trash. His mind is like a garbage can. It's full of every foul, rotten idea tossed in there by each passing lunatic over the years. But the citizens of our nation, in ignoring their history, permitted his fermenting rise to power by tolerating what he is and what is behind him. And that is our nation's historic enemy, the oligarchical, imperial, British principle, the doctrine that man is inherently evil. It was against that British and ancient satanic notion that our forefathers fought a war of independence. It is that same satanic notion which threatens our nation and the world with destruction today. And it is up to us to root it out with all of its offshoots, Newt included, once and for all. Many of you in this room, and many more persons known to you, were presented with something quite foreign to real American history during the years you imagined you were acquiring an education. Straight from the hallowed halls of fraud at Britain's Oxford and Cambridge universities. Oh, you're going to save me from breaking my neck here? No, thank you. You were given the idea that the American Revolution was the accidental result of a nasty little spat between the generous but demanding Mother Britain and her rebellious colonial offspring, who were demanding more tea and crumpets than she could afford. Well, our founding fathers and many of their forefathers dating back to the 17th century knew better. They knew that Mother Britain, referred to by John Quincy Adams as Our Lady Macbeth Mother, was evil. They knew it from Thomas Hobbes, tutor of the bestial King Charles II. They knew Hobbes's argument in his Leviathan that by nature human society was merely a state of war of each against all. Man's inherently evil nature, said Hobbes, must be restrained under a monarchical dictatorship, a notion which the libertine Charles II found quite pleasing when he assumed the throne following the English Civil War. They knew it from John Locke, who declared that the human mind was merely a passive register of animal sensations, that man was a beast. They knew that Locke was the champion of free trade for the homosexual Dutch Prince William of Orange, who seized the throne of England in 1689. They knew that Locke had advocated in 1701, as a member of King William's Board of Trade, that all the independent charters governing the American colonies be revoked, and that all land titles granted under them be made the property of the king, and that all American manufacturing of finished goods be banned. They knew the evil behind the mask of free trade. Yet to the so-called educated American today, bobbing along in the tide of British historical bilge, Hobbes appears to surface as a profound conservative thinker ahead of his time, and Locke even as the father of American constitutional liberty. The sodomized launderers of Oxbridge have worked for centuries to provide a cleaner appearance for these evil creatures, and so you came to know them in their altered states. But in this British oligarchical chamber of horrors, there is one figure, first displayed in the early years of the 18th century, so openly, vividly, and thoroughly evil that no serious attempt was ever made to launder his image. Consequently, he has been hidden from ordinary public view, yet he is worshipped to this day by the degenerate gurus of Newt Gingrich's conservative revolution. His name was Bernard Mandeville. Born in Holland in 1670, he acquired a medical degree at Leiden in 1691 and slithered into London a few years later in the wake of William of Orange's Venetian-rigged takeover. He was a monster, probably spawned in the scum scooped from the open sewers of Venice, where they more politely refer to them as canals. Not surprisingly, his medical specialty was stomach disorders. Mandeville's career in Britain, however, was dedicated to only one purpose, that of prescribing the doctrine that evil itself is the basis for good. In 1714, the year that Britain's Venetian party completed its murderous coup against the regime of Queen Anne, Bernard Mandeville anonymously published his Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits. It proclaimed what became the official governing doctrine of the emerging British Empire, that vice, corruption, and downright evil were the necessary, desirable foundations of a successful, prosperous state. Mandeville argued that man's uninhibited pursuit of his natural evil instincts constituted liberty, that the state therefore ought not to interfere with private vices, and that this seething mass of evil in the aggregate constituted the public good. This is free trade. This is laissez-faire. This is libertarianism. This is privatization. This is the conservative revolution.
So as you see there, things do come to life, slithering to life. The second clip I have is slightly longer and was done on President's Day in 2002. And this is a part of a panel, as that was part of a panel on the conservative revolution. This is part of a panel on the American intellectual tradition, in which I talked about Hamilton, Graham talked about the early New England colonization, Tony Chaikin talked about Lincoln, and Richie Freeman talked about FDR. And, you know, Graham was more ill at this time, but I think you will still get the fundamental polemic here, which is that those who believe that the New England colonization was a bunch of stodgy, small-minded Puritans out for themselves, you know, are really full of it. So go ahead.
The task of the people of the United States, as conceived by our nation's founders, is fundamentally simple. It is to do good, and to do good such that others may have the opportunity to do likewise.
Error? Okay. I thought maybe he just didn't get a new coat for a few years. It's possible. He was a philosophical scholar,
the
not
American
a...
intellectual tradition as it developed from the beachhead secured by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s to the Revolution and the founding of the United States. The fundamental outlook respecting the nature and purpose of man is essentially the same throughout, as is the general economic policy. But the fight to realize those objectives has several distinct levels, as does the level of ideas brought to bear. To simplify the matter for discussion, the names Winthrop and Mather
might best characterize the first phase, Leibniz and Swift the second phase, and Benjamin Franklin for the period reaching to the establishment of the Federal Republic. And I would propose that it's best to consider Franklin as representing the continuity of all their influences from his youth in Boston through his career in Philadelphia. Now, the continuity is important, and as John Adams put it in a letter in 1807 to Benjamin Rush, a fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence, I have always laughed at the affectation of representing American independence as a novel idea, as a modern discovery, as a late invention. The idea of it as a possible thing, as a probable event, nay, as a necessary and unavoidable measure in case Great Britain should assume an unconstitutional authority over us, has been familiar to Americans from the first settlement of the country and was as well understood by Governor Winthrop as by Governor Sam Adams. Now, in this first phase, just to sketch quickly some of the concrete manifestations of what Nancy stressed in the broad sweep to our becoming a republic, the one unique in the world, for its view of the for its view of the sacred individual personality, the importance of nurturing the creative potential of every human being, and therefore the necessity to develop citizens. And the only government that can do that is to have citizens develop and guide, essentially, a republic. So, from the first mere 800 people who landed on the shores of Massachusetts in 1630, under the guidance of John Winthrop, who became their most prominent governor and political, you might say, philosopher, scientist, engineer. The ideas were explicitly defined as, even before they set sail, it is a moral duty to develop this entire, then almost unexplored continent. It is a moral duty to do also only that which is good, just, and honest. And that's how you define Christian liberty. And to lay down your lives if need be. And as a project inherited from Europe and launched, remember, during the increasing devastations of the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, in those bleak circumstances, Winthrop compared the project in the Massachusetts Bay as the effort to construct a city upon a hill before the eyes of the entire world. Now, to make that a defensible proposition, of course, Massachusetts did a number of things which, as a state, had never been done. First of all, they managed to smuggle a charter giving them self-governing powers, elections, and essentially in every conceivable measure but the final conflict, a sovereign republic free from Britain, leaving Britain very little choice but to either come in and try to literally crush it or wait for a chance to outflank it. Winthrop, meanwhile, proceeded to develop a a citizen militia, 1,000-man strong, even by the 1630s when King Charles first tried to say, hey, give me that charter back because it's getting out of hand, and we know what you're going to do with it if you have all this freedom to develop. They had to, therefore, also to nurture the citizenry that they were developing, create the world's first compulsory universal system of free education, which they did and built up during the 1640s. They were the first to basically establish a written constitution, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, in 1641. And they were the first to actually write the laws and then devoted the only printing press in the colony to printing the laws. So there couldn't be any arbitrary rule by a judge saying, well, actually the law is happening this way today. And then. But instead, a continuity, a trust that the citizen could place in the laws of his own government. And his Republican participation in it, those rights were also specified and defined, as they were restraints and rights, powers of the judiciary, the legislature, and so on. All of this then enabled them to undertake an extraordinary pace of economic development, which again was the explicit outlook from the beginning. To develop this whole continent according to essentially the mandate of increase and multiply, be fruitful, subjugate nature, give due glory to the creature, but provide for man to live the best he could in the image of God. So soon they had rolling state subsidies and tax exemptions for manufacturing, this by 1640. A crash program began in 1643 to develop critical automated iron production, from blast furnaces and forges to rolling and slitting mills and so on. And by 1647 these were fully operational and putting out more wrought iron than any of the best works in England. Massachusetts, even by this point, had already reached a population of 14,000, which did not count thousands more who'd moved on to new settlements in Connecticut. And in a further step towards economic sovereignty, they created a mint in 1642 and began issuing their own metal currency at first, the pine tree shilling, which was redeemable only within Massachusetts Bay to prevent its being drained out of the colony, subject to currency warfare and so forth. Winthrop's son, John Winthrop Jr., who had completed these ironworks, then moved on to Connecticut in 1647. He rapidly built that up. The Connecticut colonies, which were scattered, were integrated under his command and governorship by 1657. And with the so-called Restoration, which brought Hobbes's pupil Charles II to the throne in England again, the restoration of the monarchy, Winthrop maneuvered to secure a charter for Connecticut as a whole modeled on Massachusetts. Charles II wasn't in a position to dictate too many terms at first. And in December of 61, Winthrop was also elected as a founding member of the Royal Society, which ostensibly celebrates intellectual leadership, but was also there as a watchdog and a monitor. And their eyes had been attracted to what was going on in America and in New England in particular, most assuredly. John Winthrop Jr. was the leading New England intellectual of his day. He was an astronomer, a geologist, a physician, inventor. He also corresponded personally with Leibniz in his later years. He died in 1676. Now, the remaining issue was opening the whole continent. And there was a strategy virtually from the outset, but it began to take shape towards the end of the 1600s. But there were some storm clouds in the way. The strategy was fairly simple. I've reviewed this somewhat before. If we could have the map slide, please. I'll just give you very quickly. I'm going too slow. This is unheard of for me. I better start speaking faster or cutting more out, huh? Okay. Just very quickly, you have three-pronged strategy is to get through these eastern Appalachian mountain chains to open up the Ohio River Valley to the Mississippi, command all of that, the Great Lakes, and so forth, and then you would have the basis to create essentially a emerging superpower under Republican sovereign government as a republic. The three routes that they were opening went through to Virginia, out through what was now West Virginia to reach approximately the site of Pittsburgh. That was one prong they were aiming at. They wished to aim across New York and intersect the Great Lakes, approximately where Oswego is today. And also on a southern course to get through the Blue Ridge along the James River, and out into the New River system, feeding back up into the Ohio. All of these axes or probes have been set in motion. Leibniz had a direct hand in keeping tabs on at least one of them, the one that crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia for the first time in the 1660s. Now, the part that I've been billed for here on Franklin, I intended to spend a little more time on this early phase because I think without that background, you don't understand either the continuity of Leibniz's role or who Franklin actually is. Because when you then bring this battle to open the continent and find the basis to defeat the grip of England or any other oligarchical power upon this, what amounts to an heir of the Renaissance project to sustain that vision of man. What occurred is the exciting part of the story. The interventions that were led, culminating in an extraordinary period around 1710 by Jonathan Swift, the extraordinary both satirist, polemicist, and essentially political agent and coordinator for Leibniz for the English-speaking world, who between Britain, Ireland, and his contacts into America set in motion a great surge of political development, westward economic development and exploration, beginning in 1710 with the direct cooperation of Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was the man who trained Benjamin Franklin in his youth and whom Benjamin Franklin credits at several occasions later in his life as the single most important influence on his entire career and life. So that convergence gives us Franklin finally in a position in his youth in Massachusetts and then moving to Pennsylvania to begin to become the leading player in orchestrating to the point we could actually fight a successful revolution, military phase included, to secure the independence of the most precious republic the world had seen. So we'll pick more up in the discussion.
Now, for the past couple years, Graham had turned his attention in particular to another leading figure of the American tradition, Abraham Lincoln. I believe, once again, thinking very much from the present as to the principle of leadership and what would actually be involved in terms of the relationship of a leader to the population, the qualities of a leader, and to try to teach the population to appreciate that leader. And from that standpoint, he saw the way in which Lincoln developed himself and sacrificed himself for the sake of the Union as epitomizing a principle of leadership which Lynn himself represents today. And while we have the work in the EIR, we also are pleased to have a very short video clip taken by the youth. Graham had the opportunity to give 3 or 4 classes, maybe 5, to a number of the youth movements on the East Coast. And one of those lectures occurred at Gettysburg. And we have a fairly informal video of one portion of that trip, which I would like you to see because it'll give you an idea. This was done on June 30th, 2002, and you'll recognize Colin Lowry probably there in the background, the driver and otherwise important sidekick.
And now he's going to get to Washington alive because they've taken out the Baltimore threat and so on. And he says that he will not compromise with these principles. And if anybody expects him as president or whatever to deal or negotiate or do anything that would cause him to have to surrender those principles. He says, I would rather be assassinated on the spot. I won't let it happen. When he becomes president, they start raising soldiers, calling them up to volunteer. They funnel them into Washington. And he said, because I don't think that the soldiers and sailors of the United States, the common soldiers, the common sailors of the United States, the ordinary citizens of the United States, they will not permit the destruction of the country that George Washington gave them. They won't permit it. And so the White House was open all the time. You know, soldiers would come in just to sit down and write a letter to their sweeties and so forth. They could say, hey, be busy. They come in and talk to the President of the United States. His cabinet members looked at him and said, you can't spend all the time with these people. They're people. You know, you gotta spend time with people standing, authority. What do I want to do that for? These are the people who are going to decide whether or not we continue to have a nation. Of course I'm going to talk to them. I can't do it around the clock. But he did. He was the most open president we ever had.
We want to move now to two musical tributes to Graham. I don't know that we can get the one from the West Coast. A young man there had prepared A Man's a Man for All That for Graham, which is a setting of Robert Burns' poem of Republican origin. No, it can't be done, unfortunately. Maybe later on. So the other presentation we have is Abendempfindung by Mozart, sung by Susan Bowen, accompanied by John Asher. And I believe you all have the words in your handout for those of you who need them. We think we have success. To switch back to the video conferencing with LA, just hold still a couple minutes and we're trying to switch. I think they'll show on the screen when we get them. Hey! Okay, I think we will probably hear Aaron Halevi sing.
We're not getting any audio yet.
No audio yet? Okay, well,
Ready with the audio? Okay, we're waiting for you. Complex domain.
very complex domain. There's someone at the piano. See that?
Okay, well, we're not getting good. Mics up for us to hear.
Hello?
Hello.
Okay.
Is that Harley?
Turn it up? This is going to be strange.
Is Aaron?
What? Hello?
Hello.
It's working. It's just echoing.
Well, we're ready for you.
Should I just sing it anyway? Be like a chorus? All right. Just hold on 1 minute. Thank you. Thank you. Should I begin yet?
Yes, begin.
Okay. Any... Just go. Robert Burns, man's a man for all that. Should I do it still? With the echo? No? There's still an echo. I'm sorry. That's not really my fault. Okay? All right. Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that, and all that, our toils obscure, and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gout for all that. What though on hamely fare we dine, where hot and grey and all that, give fools our silks and knaves our wine, the man's a man afar that, for all that, and all that their tinsel show, and all that the honest man, though e'er say par, is king of men afar that. Ye see on Barky Cod a lord was struts and stars and all that, though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a kiff for all that, and all that, their dignities, and all that, the man a independent mind. He looks and laughs at all that. A prince can make a belted knight, a marquis duke, and all that. But an honest man's a boon he's meeked, gate faithy man afar that. For all that, and all that, that ribbon star, and all that, the pith of sense and pride of worth are higher rank than all that. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will, for all that. That sense of worth o'er the earth shall bear the grief and all that. For all that, and all that, it's coming yet, for all that, that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that. All right.
And I do think Graham would like all that.